Let's say they were perfectly healthy, but they were in a car accident and they suffered a traumatic brain injury, and now they need assistance for long-term care benefits like Medicaid, VA, or they're reaching and accessing Social Security. But they can't access those benefits because they have their own money. Maybe they successfully were employed, or maybe they had an inheritance. They have their own money that's preventing them from accessing benefits. If it's an individual's own money, we then have to create what's called a first-party special needs trust, where we use the assets of that individual to create that special needs trust.
Welcome to the Answers for Elders radio show.
And welcome everyone to Answers for Elders Radio Network, heard across the USA and on your favorite podcast channel. Today's topic, I think, is very important. So many of us have a loved one that may have special needs, may have a disability. There's so many times I will get a phone call from someone saying, my husband was just diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's, and I don't know what to do. He needs care, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose my house. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my money. All of the things that happens. And so this is a very important topic for those of you that may be in a situation where you're thinking about that, or thinking about that for, maybe one of your parents and there's a spouse still left, or a child that has special needs or anything like that. So I am very proud to introduce to you Andrea Lee, who is an elder law and estate planning attorney for Legacy Estate Planning. And Andrea, I'm so glad you're back with us. Welcome to Answers for Elders.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm so happy to be here, and I am so happy to have the opportunity to talk to our audience about special needs trusts and how people can protect their own resources if they face incapacity. They can also use special needs trusts to protect resources on behalf of a spouse who might be incapacitated, or of a child. Some of my clients come in because they might be doing okay, but they have a child who has Down syndrome or suffered a traumatic brain injury, or something has happened to them, and they're trying to find a way to continue in supporting that child after they themselves pass away.
Exactly.
There's so many uses for special needs trusts, and I'm just excited to share that with our audience.
Yes. So as we're going to start, Andrea, would you define, we're using this term special needs trust. Define what that is.
All right. So it's a difficult thing to define per se. First, I think I'm going to start by saying a little bit about what a special needs trust is not. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it is. It's not unusual for someone to call me up and say, my parents are facing incapacity. I heard that, I want to create a trust to protect their assets. And people are thinking revocable living trusts, but the reality is revocable living trusts offer no asset protection.
Right.
And people are so frequently confused that a revocable living trust will protect their resources. Now, a special needs trust is a very specific type of a trust that was created under the laws of 1965 that allow individuals to create a trust for the purpose of protecting those funds from Social Security spend downs, or evaluations, from Medicaid. So they're typically trusts that are specifically designed that allow an individual to be a beneficiary of that trust, and to also have those assets not be counted when they are being considered for either Medicaid or Social Security benefits.
Yes.
Now,
or veterans benefits.
Or veterans benefits, depending. Veterans benefits are a little bit trickier, so we usually focus on Social Security and Medicaid. For veterans benefits, you do need to disclose if you're the beneficiary of a trust, and then they analyze it. So we usually focus on Medicaid or Social Security.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Now, there are typically 3 types of special needs trusts. One is what's called a first-party special needs trust. And that is a special needs trust that is created using an individual's own resources. So they're the least popular type of special needs trusts, and we only create them or use them in a circumstance when we can't use a different type of special needs trust.
Mhm.
I might use a special needs trust, or an individual might use a special needs trust under the following circumstances. Let's say they were perfectly healthy, but they were in a car accident and they suffered a traumatic brain injury and they own their own assets. And now they need assistance for long-term care benefits like Medicaid, VA, or they're reaching and accessing Social Security, depending on the circumstances. But they can't access those benefits because they have their own money. Maybe they successfully were employed, or maybe they had an inheritance. They have their own money that's preventing them from accessing benefits. If it's an individual's own money, we then have to create what's called a first party special needs trust, where we use the assets of that individual to create that special needs trust.
Interesting.
Now, first party special needs trusts do have a lot of limitations, so we don't use them as often as the other type of special needs trust I want to focus on today, which are third party special needs trusts. First party special needs trusts, number one, like I said, they're only and always created with an applicant or a beneficiary's own money. However, to be eligible and in order to create a first party special needs trust, that applicant has to be under the age of 65. So
Ah,
yes, that's the key. So many of my clients, many of the listeners who are listening to this right now might not be eligible for that first party special needs trust because they might exceed that age max that would allow them to create that first party special needs trust.
interesting. But there's a lot of scenarios like with early onset Alzheimer's.
Mhm.
Those types of situations, I could totally see where that would apply.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first party special needs trusts are great resources for individuals who really need long-term care, but they have a chunk of money that is in their name. And
Mm-hmm.
if they have to spend it down and they're only limited to having $2,000, and it's such a waste of that money because once they're on Medicaid, if they're on Social Security, they don't really have a lot of money to throw around and to provide for their quality of life.
Right.
The other limitation of that first party special needs trust is it must have a Medicaid payback. So an individual
Oh,
can
yeah.
create that third party special needs trust. They could choose the trustee. They
Mm-hmm.
cannot be their own trustee, but they could choose a trusted child. They could choose a professional organization. That money is protected and it's used to provide good quality of life quality for the beneficiary, but what they don't use during their lifetime must be paid back to the state to reimburse Medicaid.
Interesting.
Yes. So while first party special needs trusts can be fabulous options for some of our clients and for individuals who don't have good alternatives, most of my clients are much better served with what we call a third party special needs trust.
Wow. Okay. So what is a third party special needs trust?
Well, third party special needs trust is a trust that's created with the assets of a non-applicant. So, the way we typically will create that third party special needs trust is, let's say we have a married couple. I mean, you started this podcast by saying so many clients come in, they're afraid that they're going to lose their home. They're afraid they're going to lose all of their assets. They're going to,
I bet once a week at minimum, I get a phone call from someone in the US or an email saying, my husband was just diagnosed with dementia. He's failing fast. I don't know how I'm going to live. And the first thing I say is you need to get a hold of a estate planning or elder law attorney to help you.
right. Yeah, that's the best advice you can give someone because I practice in the state of Washington. And even though special needs trusts are created based on a federal law and special needs trusts exist in all 50 states, The way each state interprets and treats those special needs trusts
Mm-hmm.
different. So even though I could talk about special needs trusts in the broadest terms, if somebody is really interested in talking about how special needs trust could serve them individually, they really need to meet with an elder law attorney in the state where they reside, because that elder law attorney can
Absolutely.
sit down with them and formulate a
Mm-hmm.
fantastic estate plan that will protect their assets, that will allow them to not lose their house, that will allow them to preserve some of their assets. And there's a lot of ways that we can preserve assets for a married couple, and allowing them to not become destitute just because
Mm-hmm.
one spouse has that terrible diagnosis or one spouse becomes incapacitated.
Exactly. I mean, I see so often, just because people are not informed, I see them going down the rabbit hole of losing, their home. Someone I think of, someone in our backyard that spent all their money to take care of her husband. This is years ago, and someone very well known to me. And here she had this beautiful home in Shoreline,
Mhm.
and but she had a reverse mortgage up to, yin yang, and she was living on like $1,000 a month.
Yeah, it's
And I'm going like, had you been set up before with the special needs trust, your husband would have gotten the same amount of care and you wouldn't be living in poverty.
Yeah,
And that's
possibly
the
if the planning is done properly.
Mhm.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
biggest mistake I do see over and over again are people, I kind of want to say it's being penny wise and pound foolish. They
Yes.
don't want to spend a few $1,000s to consult with a qualified elder law attorney, but if they had sat down with someone and developed a good plan, they
Mm.
likely could have preserved hundreds of thousands of dollars.
That is very important. And in our next segment, Andrea, you and I are going to talk a little bit about those plans,
Yep,
and considerations regarding special
absolutely.
needs trust
And I'm
right
going to
after
talk
this.
you through third-party special needs trusts.
Perfect. Right after this.
Did you know that you can discover hundreds of podcasts in our library on senior care? So visit our website and discover our decision guides that will help you also navigate decision making. Find us at answersforelders.com.